Here is Monteverde Fire Opal, an orange ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook. A very red leaning orange, or perhaps an orange leaning red. Either case, I'm calling it orange, although I know I could be wrong and it could be a red. Whatever, there's tone variation by nib, but more like a reversal of the shading. You'll see exactly what I'm talking about with the Clairfontaine. It's very obvious there. And so yes, it does shade and does a great job doing it. It does well on the non-fountain pen friendly paper. Granted, I have really cultivated what paper I use at this point, which is why it's fairly the same ones. I do think a whole page of this is a little bit much on the eyes, though it doesn't burn your eyes as a whole page of it. It's just a little bit much. Makes it a great second color on the page that I really enjoyed using. All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with a fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub. The pen for today is a Sailor, my first pen. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the extra fine nib, we get a great orange that does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade really a ton. There's a lot of back and forth between the orange and the darker red. It's so much that it's a little bit harder to point out, but I'll begin with some of it, looking at beginning on the first line, where the B has lighter tones and darker tones. It's darker mostly, lightens up a bit into the E, much darker at the G, showing off that I, or that red into the I. The N and IN are the orange again, and that G at the end darkens back to the red. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, showing much more red than orange. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade as the reversal of what was going on with the extra fine. Now we get a lot more of the red at the top of this because the pen sat for about 2 or 3 days before I filmed this. Not a big deal. You see it really level out in what's going on halfway through the second line. A lot of value in what's going on for your money on this for shading. Look at value of money on the third line, where the VA is lighter than the L that darkens up quite a bit. The UE, the U lightens, the E becomes very dark. Of shows tons of color variation back and forth. The money starts a little bit darker orange on the M, lightens a little bit on the O, and the EY at the end get quite a bit darker and red. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, which is lighter than it was with the medium. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade in a very pretty way. Look at pretty on the first line, where the P is darker. It's the loop of the P starts to lighten up a little bit into the R, where it lightens a little bit more. Slightly darker on the E. The TT a little bit darker. The Y is quite a bit darker. Not bad when you look at bad right next to that, where the BA are a lighter red, lightens a little bit to that orange at the bottom of the D, very dark red at the top of the D. And a lot of this shading goes on quite a bit throughout all of this writing, really showcasing the shading here with the broad nib. Looking at the back of the page, there is no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 11 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, showing much more of it being red with occasional bits of orange. It does not feather and it does not spread, and as I already alluded to, there is a little bit of shading that goes on. You can see it behind on the second line, where the BE is a little bit lighter than the H, which is darker. The I, N, and beginning of the D are lightening up some. It's the end of that D that does get a bit darker. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does have some little bits of shading going on in an enchanted sort of way when we look at enchanted on the second line, where the EN is lighter than the H. That's the ENC. The H gets a little bit darker into that A. The N and beginning of the T are lighter, and it works its way darker to very dark with the D at the end. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, tiny bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade just as well as could be expected when you look at expected on the first line. Where the EXP are a bit dark, the EC lighten up a little bit. The T is very dark. The E lightens just a little bit, but still being darker. The D at the bottom is much lighter than it is at the top. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and we can easily continue our notes back here. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, though it shows really as a red, with no feathering, with no spread, with some shading, but the shading seems to go from a mid-tone red to a darker red, really being an effect of the color of the paper, showing the ink is a little bit translucent. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get a little bit of shading going on, just as it did with the extra fine, where it's more that it's a lighter red into a darker red. Really, the effect of the paper on this ink makes it not come across as a red. Or as an orange. It comes across as red. Is it red leaning orange or is it orange leaning red? Still a little confused. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, a little bit lighter than it was, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade, not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but it does shade. And on top of that, you can see orange coming through, and not faintly either. Look at faint on the second line, where the FA are a red, the IN lighten up a little bit, T quite a bit darker. This is no trick of the lights that are going on when you look at trick on the third line. The TRI are orange. The C starts to darken just a little bit, but that K at the end, definitely a much darker and red. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. We can easily continue our notes back here. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It does stand out against the quad rule, which is the major reason for looking at this. It stands out with no problem, which is something that I tend to worry a little bit about on some of the, I'm going to call them accent colors for the page, which is where I really think of this one. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade very well when you can hear the sound of my voice. Looking at sound on the second line, that starts darker with the S, lightens a bit to the O, darker on the U, lighter on the N, darker into the D. Lots of shading, easily standing out on this quad rule. Fantastic. Looking at the stub nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was with the medium. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. There's a couple of moments that I do see the ink being broken up by some of the vertical lines. You see it on Grim on the second line, or different on the third line, but it stands out against the quad rule, and it doesn't break up when it hits those lines all the time, which just could be, you know, freaky moments within the writing. It's not distracting in what's happening. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting, easily continuing our notes back here. Awesome. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Blackstone Wild Orange. Here is Califolio Itsuyama. Here is Diamine Honey Burst. Here is Robert Oster Tangerine. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Very definitely an orange ink here. No feather, no spread, almost nothing for shading. Really not a quality here that's standing out, though it does show itself a little bit. The biggest thing to me is that a student using this, it stands out against the quad rule. It doesn't get lost in there because this paper can often make an ink look a little bit flatter. It's not having a problem. It's doing really well. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there's almost nothing for shading. You can see it a little bit tightened. The first word on the first line is quite a bit darker than what's going on around it. It on the second line starts lighter, gets darker at the T, like I said. On the third line, the SAI and beginning of the D are lighter than that up and down stroke of the D. Still standing out strong against these quad rule. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade, the kind of shade you throw a party for when you look at party on the first line, where the P is dark, the A lightens up a little bit, the R lightens a little bit more, the T starts to darken some, the Y at the end gets a lighter beginning and very dark at the end, standing out strong against the quad rule. Fight the rule. Looking at the back of the page, our student's going to be happy that they can continue their notes back here and that nothing bled through to the page underneath. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page. Here is Krishna Paakaza. Here is KWZ Brown number 4. Here is Lamy Peridot. Here is Sailor Bungobox Tipsy. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread. Now, the feathering and the spread that are occurring are serviceable in what's happening, but there's more of the reddish tone coming through here. It's an orange, more
red leaning, not really shading so much, so it's just changing the tone of this ink some. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Yes, it feathers, and yes, it spreads. It's a little distracting here. I think it just crossed that line of, I wouldn't want to use it. I don't see this as a good match. Just no. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread. The squeegee action of that stub nib was working in its benefit, because while it does feather and it does spread, I think what we're getting here is usable in its entirety. The feathering and the spreading is not something that's so distracting it would be a problem. So 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Looking at the back of the page, you can see that there's no taking notes on the back of this page unless you want to destroy both sides of the notes and not being able to read it. However, you are not going to destroy the notes on the next page as it did not bleed through.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The extra fine shows as a red leaning orange with excellent shading, and the medium as an orange leaning red with a reversal of the extra fine with really good shading. Now the broad looks just like the extra fine in tone and shading, but I really think it brought out that shading especially well. So it's a matter of the shading preference, and instead of a red-orange, I kind of prefer the orange to leaning red. Confusing, I know, but that means that I really want to go with a medium flow, extra fine, or broad, and that's what I go for. A broad if it's going to be really my main writer on that page, and the extra fine if it's going to be the second color on the page, and that just has to do with space to fit those additional notes.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.